Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And truly, I mean that. Please continue to stay well and stay safe during these times. And today, if you don't mind, I'd like very much to carry on with our discussion of the recent releases made by the Criterion collection during this year of 2020. And today I'd like to focus in, if I may, on a film that is included as part of the extraordinary set that was recently released by the Criterion collection, which is what I have here, Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project number 3. The film that I'd like to focus on today is another amazing achievement from 1970, and this is from the filmmaker Med Hondo. This film has been designated spy number 1049. It is this film, SOLEIL. This is the 1970 work, the extraordinary, outstanding work of art from the brilliant filmmaker artist Med Hondo. This is, of course, SOLEIL, which can be translated, the title can be translated into English as, I believe, O Sun, S-U-N, O Sun, or SOLEIL. If I were to try to describe what this film was about, the essence of this film in terms of its narrative, I would say, well, first I acknowledge my oversimplified manner in which I describe it, and so in which case I strongly suggest that you rely on the brilliant supplements and the essay that are included with this great Criterion release. I strongly recommend those, and I will talk about those momentarily. But in my own terms, I would say that the film is, in essence, about the depiction or the description of the African immigrant experience. That is, the immigrant experience to Europe, and the ways in which that immigrant experience is informed or affected or otherwise adversely impacted by attitudes that are related to economic situations and economic realities, class, and also race and racism, and the viewpoints and attitudes and societal constructions that were very prevalent during this time. We have to remember the film was made in the late 1960s into 1970s, so we must keep that in mind, especially also when we consider that one of the key notions that is embedded in this description or in this situation is the notion of colonialism, and the idea of colonialism being turned into or transformed into, via the process of history, the immigrant experience, and how those two essential situations are perhaps at odds with each other, or maybe they are more consistent with each other than one might initially realize. And I think if we begin to try to piece together the strands and links and connections that we have between these two essential states, then I think we can realize that the film SOLEIL is really speaking towards a discussion, a societal-based discussion that leads to very eye-opening and quite disturbing conclusions, thus making the film a truly brilliant and essential work of art that operates on many, many different levels. So if I were to explain again in my admittedly very poor and very ill-equipped manner, because I am not in any way an expert when it comes to this history, but my understanding, based on, among other things, the materials found in the Criterion collection and other places, are that the reasons why the film, I think, operates so brilliantly as it does, I think, are many. So one of those reasons is the way in which different modes of cinematic style are combined and being expressed here. And so we have what might be termed to be and I mean this very positively, a surface level visual quality of the film. Okay, and so to be specific about that, that surface level visual quality of the film is made up of many different components or many different expressions of cinematic visual style. And so we have the way in which the camera seems to be engaged with the characters and the subject matter a la documentary style. And that gives way to some very famous sequences in the film. There's one very famous sequence involving two characters and the Champs-Élysées. And that seems to have a very cinema verite type of feel to it. A documentary that is really picking up the moment. The camera seeming to move around and trying to pick up the moment as it's occurring before us. And yet there are other modes of cinematic expression that are very on the opposite end in terms of a non-fiction based type of approach. In other words, we go to the other end in terms of, for example, the employment of animation in some aspects, the employment of other aspects that are very much theater based. And we see a lot of expressions of the sort of thematic concerns a la colonialism and the immigrant experience. And we see a lot of these modes expressed via very stylized theatrical presentations, which I think serve a really important function. And we also have a film that, in relation to that, is also very heavily stylized to the extent that it can, and some scenes can be described as being very avant-garde. The use of props and costume and sound that can be said to be very much disjointed and very much reliant on, say, the absurd and maybe the surreal in some cases. There are many ways in which cinema is used in a kind of dialectic nature. We have themes and ideas that seem to be at odds with each other on purpose, and that is meant to create a further idea or concept or notion or meaning derived from that. So if we go back to my initial example of the kind of documentary style type of scene that takes place on the Champs-Élysées and involving a young man and a young woman and people looking, passers-by looking on as they are together. And we see also how this on the visual surface might seem to be a very documentary type of style, but yet we realize if we listen to the soundtrack and the sounds that are employed, we realize that there is a lot of a beautifully constructed, disjointed nature that can be described also in dialectic terms. And this is also, I think, meant to have a real edge to it. And that edge leads into how the visual, or let's say my phrase earlier, the surface level, and I meant that in a very positive way, how the surface level gives way to or is connected to quite in an integrated way the deeper roots and the deeper substance that is at the heart of this film. And so we have psychological impacts of certain societal attitudes that can be described as being quite adversely affecting and also quite racist. So we see this played out in a very overt way in a lot of the scenes, but also in a very subtle and very indirect way. And so there is still, in many ways, a level of shock and unease, which resonates on a psychological level. And this is further augmented, as I tried to suggest, in the way in which the visual styles seem to blend or clash with each other or among each other in a very indelible and instinctive way vis-a-vis the viewer. And so it's meant, I think, to reflect this kind of unease or suddenness or shock value that is associated with racist attitudes. And there is, I think, also inherent in that the notion of the scope of history and the way in which the immigrant experience, the African immigrant experience, is inextricably linked with with history. And when I say this, I have to be very specific because my use of the word history here is quite loaded. When I say history, I also must emphasize that it's not just the substance of history that is at play here, but it's also the way in which history is viewed and perceived, and the experience of viewing history from a certain perspective. And I would dare say that this film is really asking us to question certain modes or perspectives of viewing certain aspects of history having to do generally or specifically with colonialism and the African immigrant experience, and also, generally speaking, attitudes that are in respect of cultures of Africa and not just the continent, but also of a diasporic nature as well. And so I think this film, through its quite stylized, inventive, and very provocative style and manner, I think it is asking us to really call into question a lot of these perspectives, such that I think it is meant to allow us to have an even closer appreciation and a much more emphatic and empathetic appreciation and intimate link with the characters and the depictions of these characters and what they are going through in this society in the late 1960s. And from there, I think the film can speak to us not just on those contextualized terms, which I think are really brilliant, but also on a broad universal level, such that we can look at this and really see how this film is dealing with themes and topics that have an impact even now. And it does so, as I say, in a way that is technically marvelous, a cinematic triumph. It is experimental. It is very much based on theater, on the notion of various modes of cinema, and it is using cinema in a way that is fresh, inventive, and highly philosophical. This is the brilliant film SOLEIL. So with that, now let me go to the Criterion release, which is, once again, as I say, from this exciting set, Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project number 3. It's a dual format edition, so we get a DVD and Blu-ray, Zone 1, Region A. And my goodness, it looks really great. Again, the release really helps us and explains to us the painstaking efforts that went into the restoration process. So this is a real treat. And included in this, of course, are the supplements. And we have, as per usual, the short Martin Scorsese introduction. And this is approximately 3 minutes. It's a wonderful primer and you can really get into the history that is being discussed in this film. The idea that Martin Scorsese, I think, describes very well about Med Hondo and how he seems to be, in essence, inventing a whole new cinematic language. I think that's Martin Scorsese's great phrase. And about the focusing in on the African immigrant experience in Europe, and about it's also closely linked with class issues and the like. And so this is a really great place to start when trying to get into this film for the first time. So that's the introduction by Martin Scorsese, approximately 3 minutes. So it's quite short, quite brief, but still packed with a lot of great information going forward. And then we have a lovely one-on-one interview, which is in fact a collection of talks with one-on-one with Med Hondo, conducted by Francois Catonnet in 2018. And so we have it, and it's edited together in this supplement, which runs approximately 21 minutes. This is so great. Med Hondo, in his own words, describing, as I say, in his own words, his upbringing, his own experience, because if we remember, we realize that Med Hondo and his own biographical experience, I think, mirrors a lot of what's happening here in SOLEIL in terms of the immigrant experience to Europe. And in his own words, Hondo does say that he wanted to make this film as a way to get these feelings, in essence, to express them, because they were building up inside of him, and so he wanted to have a way to express them, to exorcise them in cinematic form. So this is, I think, a lot to this speaks a lot to his own experience and feelings and themes, as well as being something that is also trying to speak to a broad macro level universal truth. So that is, I think, fascinating in and of itself. So we realize that a lot of what is being said here is from the heart of Med Hondo. And in this interview, we realize how intelligent he is. He is so well spoken. He speaks about his, as I say, his upbringing, and also his exposure to many different modes of literature, of theater, and then cinema, and how this really informed his attempts to get into cinema and eventually make the film SOLEIL. One thing that's very interesting, among many things, of course, is his discussion of theater and his experiences in the theater world. And he says how he understood and appreciated that inherent in the experience of theater is the idea of the rule, what he describes as being the rule of the ephemeral nature of theater, in that one can rehearse and rehearse and rehearse for days, weeks, months on end for a particular play, only to be able to perform it maybe just a select number of times before it is over. And so that's it. So that's the ephemeral nature of theater. And so that led him, I think, on a fundamentally philosophical basis, to realize that if he wanted to create something of a real self-expression from his point of view, then he thought that cinema, with its idea of something being captured on film for it to be seen many times over, potentially anyway, he realized that that was the medium by which he could tell his story. So I think that's a really fascinating thing. That reference to theater, by the way, is also very important, because when we think about the film and we think about the certain scenes that seem to be based on a mode of the theater, and the idea of performance. And also we get a lot of that too in the essay, which I'll get to momentarily. I think we realize how important these modes of artistic expression really were to an artist like Med Hondo. So that is, I think, really revealing, and thus is an example of how utterly important this interview is, and it's so great. And as I say, on a human level, just to hear this gentleman speak, to hear him, the warmth in his voice, and you can tell also that he speaks with a lot of passion about the things that he cared about. He speaks early on about how he really disliked notions of injustice, and he speaks about this in a very calm way, in a very welcoming way, which I think really is very suggestive of how he approaches these kinds of notions of injustice, say in SOLEIL. It seems to be in a way that is, I think, very myriad, and it's also very indirect in a lot of places, and but it's also very direct as well. And so I love this sort of mixture of feelings and tones, and I kind of feel on a personal level that Med Hondo is such an intelligent and fascinating individual, that so much is being expressed through his words and his manner in this way. So, and it's just to listen to his voice as well. It's so great. So I can't recommend enough this particular supplement, the Med Hondo interview. But that's not all, because then we get the great essay that is included as part of the booklet, which is included with the set. So the set book has on page 6 the cast and crew breakdown for SOLEIL, and then on later in the book we have on page 52, or starting there, we have the beginning of the essay by scholar Aboubakar Sanogo. And this is titled, "I Bring You Greetings from Africa." And I must say that this is a top-notch essay. It's very packed and it's very dense, but I think that's one of the things that's really great about it. So I would actually recommend reading the essay many times over. And if perhaps there might be some passages or phrases, it certainly was that way for me. And so I was reading it, and I found myself having to reread some of the passages over again and again, just to make sure I could get the concepts as nailed down in my mind as I could. Because, as I say, each sentence is packed with a lot of descriptive information, and it's so expertly expressed. So please savor each line, each paragraph that's written by Sanogo here. This is great. As an example of the brilliance of this essay, he describes the mode of cinematic storytelling in this film. He describes it as not being what he says literal reenactment, but rather abstracting condensation. And that is a really brilliant choice of phrase, because that is suggestive of the way in which Med Hondo's cinema uses a kind of cinematic shorthand, which is also reliant on modes of theater and modes of other forms of expression. And this leads to the discussion by Sanogo of how Med Hondo effectively uses, mentions references to theater are very specific, and what he's using this, according to Sanogo, the film is relying on these modes of expression, artistic expression in theater and cinema, to display or to discuss or to otherwise express the notion of the colonialism into the immigrant experience, and how they are maybe not as separate from each other as one might initially think in a very cursory view of the historical nature of these two modes. And so that is, I think, a really important point to keep in mind. And also the essay goes into how the film seems to be trying to readjust or realign or create a sense of realignment within the hearts and minds of the viewers with regard to the conveying of the impact of certain specific details depicted in the film. For instance, what the essayist refers to as the Christian conversion aspect, as described in the film, and how these aspects, as expressed by Med Hondo cinema, seem to be suggesting a very, the word here is cataclysmic implication vis-a-vis the culture and the language and the spirit of these people. And we get certain very specific shots early on of men standing, and we see how they are standing there and what they themselves represent versus what we see later in the film, and how we see the immigrant experience placed in the European continent context, and how we see how perspectives seem to be changing away and into a perspective from the European point of view, rather than from the initial point of view that was relevant early on in the film. And so I think this kind of discussion by the essay is very important. And also, the essay further emphasizes the virtuosity of the film. That's the word here. The avant-garde politics are being expressed in terms of a formal virtuosity throughout. And he's describing this as in examples of the idea of a cinematic dialectic, and things seem to be combined together or maybe clashing with each other to create another concept or another idea. We see this also played out in terms of an experimental mode or nature of the cinematic structure. We see certain scenes that are constructed, but then the film leaves those scenes to go and address certain other thematic concerns, only to return. And there are other episodic and also elliptical aspects of certain scene constructions that seem to be very much indicating a very maybe psychological based approach to these particular situations, as well as a broader, maybe subjective commentary from the filmmaker himself about the sincerity or lack thereof of certain aspects of these scenes and the concepts that are being discussed here, and so on and so forth. And so and finally, the essay goes into the other brilliant artistic elements of the film. The soundtrack and the music, I think, is one really key element that the essay goes into very much on, and also the real the way in which the film was made. I mean, it was made over the course of some years, and it was, relatively speaking, quite a small production. And so it's amazing to think the achievement that was created, given the relatively limited resources that were involved, as well as what happened afterwards in terms of the film's release and what happened to it later, and such that it is now a part of the World Cinema Project, like so. And other things. And so in essence, I love the essay very much. There's a great phrase also toward the end. SOLEIL is a polyvocal film. I love that word choice here, polyvocal film. And it says, it speaks of blackness, of whiteness and white supremacy, of Africa and Europe, of the diasporic, the interracial, the decolonial, the tricontinental, the emancipatory. It apprehends Africa as not just a continent, but a global entity. Although it can hardly be pigeonholed, it first and foremost belongs in the African film heritage as a work that blazed trails and that are yet to be fully followed. That's just one excerpt from the brilliant essay from Aboubakar Sanogo. This is called I Bring You Greetings from Africa. Strongly recommended if you can. So with that, this is the extraordinary and essential work SOLEIL from Med Hondo, and I encourage you very much to check it out if you can. I think you're in for a real treat. It is vital, it is fresh, it is exciting, it is thought-provoking, it is just experimental, it is very edgy, and it is an example of the true visceral and energetic virtuosity of cinema from this time. A magnificent work of art. This is Med Hondo's SOLEIL. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you once again for your time, as always, and cheers.